Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. How are you?
Okay. Doing good.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Did you have something you wanted to talk about, Vidhi, or?
No, not really. I'm actually backing up my phone right now, and yeah, that's going on. Just looking at that,
Okay.
and yeah, so I've been working somewhere recently. This is my first time going for an offline internship, and it's kind of weird, like different from college because college is fun. Even if I join a new education place or any new academy or a new university, I think it will be very different from what is happening right now. But yeah, they have their own restrictions and stuff. They have given me a laptop, but then every like company has their own restrictions and stuff. So yeah, that
Yeah, they have a lot
hello.
stricter
Yeah,
management than other organizations, usually corporate, like IT especially.
yeah,
Yeah.
they have a lot of restrictions.
Yeah.
Like I fear that sharing anything right now over here also will be like they'll be like, oh, why did you share that? No, they just have a lot of restrictions. So yeah, I think maybe once it ends, I can talk more about it.
Okay.
And
Hmm.
yeah,
That's good.
I actually did have a few projects and presentations to show sometime back, but I don't have them right on my laptop right now. I'll show them once I can
Okay.
later on, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's good. Yeah, I look
that's
forward
great.
to it.
How was yesterday? Yeah, I had to leave yesterday's meet like midway. So has the coding period started? It has, right?
Yeah, this last week was the beginning, but it's like if you're not in
Okay.
GSOC, I'm being flexible in terms of how people spend their time. So,
Yeah, right.
but yeah, we're just starting out, so we haven't really done very much in terms of coding. I'll go over the meeting in a bit, but yeah, it's definitely
Okay.
yeah, we've been really kind of stressing the community linkages and things like that so far. So
Right. That's great.
yeah,
Nice.
yeah, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yep.
Looks like Kavya's here, and Morgan, and Vidhi, of course. Okay, well, let's go to the meeting recap. So our Diva Worm meeting was Monday, and we had Barshan and Susan and myself to start off with. And so we had a short discussion before I got into a paper on the cell-centered approach to developmental biology. And this was in Physica A. This was published in 2005. And the significance of this paper is that it was from the James Glazer Research Group. And they're at Indiana University, and they do things with a platform called CompuCell 3D. So CompuCell 3D is this biological modeling tool. It focuses on the cellular level of biology. So you model things in terms of cellular sheets, and there's some process that is fundamental to the unit of the cell. So these models called cellular POTS models, which are very similar to cellular automata, and each cell in a cellular POTS model is a cell. And then everything that goes on within the cell is simulated and determines this outward state of that cell. And then the outward state of that cell is the state within the simulation. And then those states are characterized in parallel to characterize a simulation. So you can do things like simulate sheets of cells or different types of tissues where it consists of a group of cells in different layers or whatever you would like. The idea, though, is that you have these cells that have a state, and everything within the cell that determines the state is underneath the hood. It's in the program. But you don't necessarily rely on the level of complexity you would see in normal cells. You just worry about things that are going on that determine the state of the cell. So, for example, if you're thinking about gene expression, there are data sets that demonstrate gene expression, levels of gene expression. You can go further down to characterize the process of initiation and execution of transcription and translation, and you can characterize those fractions of RNA molecules. And, all of those things are important for biological questions. Some people focus on those things as the level of abstraction in the model, in the simulation. But in the CompuCell 3D, they think about the level of the cell. So all those things are incidental to the cellular state. So they do talk in this paper a lot about the cultural differences between different types of modelers. So a lot of times when you're doing biological modeling, you have biologists, you have physicists, and you have computer scientists. And then you have people who have different definitions of what a model is, different definitions of what a cell is, different definitions of all sorts of things. And so the idea is that when you're building these models, you're oftentimes interacting with a lot of different people on your team with different cultural baggage and different expectations of the model, or of a model for that matter. So we talked about at the time they proposed the systems biology approach, and it's this is sort of the basis for how they think about modeling in CompuCell 3D. So we went over that quite a bit. We spent probably half the meeting on that, and then Susan talked about some of those things. She talked about her experiences with modeling and other things to round out the paper discussion. And so this is, I think, useful for people who are interested in this type of modeling that we do in DevoWorm. And, it's a nice paper because it goes back about 20 years now. And it talks about it presents the contemporary view of biology and systems biology and modeling, which is to say there was a very heavy emphasis on omics, on getting like some information about the cell or about the genome or about proteins, and then like doing these high throughput assays or these assays where you get a huge amount of data and then just using that in the model, and it wasn't necessarily very clear how you would use it. You just had to get it and then use it somehow. And that was, of course, maybe we've learned since then how to do this better. There have been better models of data handling and things like that. So, this paper is an interesting look back into the world of 20 years ago and how people kind of thought about these issues, as systems biology was really kind of in its early years, let's face it. And of course, how the omics revolution has changed since this paper. So we had a nice discussion about that. We had, I think Barshan appreciated it because, he's doing things with modeling biology ultimately, and a lot of computing applications, kind of rely on this level of abstraction. So what would you include in a cellular level of abstraction versus like a proteomic or a genomic level of abstraction? Okay, the next paper we talked about was this top-down perspectives on cell membrane potential and protein transcription. And this is a paper by Michael Levin and some colleagues, Javier Cervera and Salvador Maffei. And this is kind of their approach to what they call top-down modeling, which is where they're looking at electrophysiology of cells. They're looking at electrical signals that play a role in morphogenesis. In other words, electrical signals that go between cells and coordinate those cells and determine changes in the shape of tissues and the state of the cells. So this is like they go over this top-down method, which is to think about simulations not from the perspective of generating the electrical potential, but the effects of the electrical potential on the cell state and on like different tissue states and things like that. So we went through the paper again and linked it to the first paper, and then we had a discussion on that. Morgan had some things to say about that paper. And so that was our DevoWorm meeting. It was pretty low-key this week. Our second meeting was the open source meeting. That was on Friday. And so Vidhi and Barshan and myself started the meeting. And people joined later on, actually. We did get Jess and Morgan and Kavya pretty closely after. And Jess talked about some of his things that are going on in Joe Pro, his mentoring organization. And he talked about how they're doing all sorts of different activities. They're doing this data and direction group. They're doing things with they're doing things with mentoring. They're doing things with building a web presence and building new websites. And then they're doing things with outreach. So it's kind of interesting stuff that he's been talking about. And then, we had a little discussion, I believe, about some of the things we talked about last week in this meeting. We talked about agentic AI and EdTech. So there are a lot of EdTech questions revolving around agentic AI and those sorts of things. Jess had some things to say about that, Barshan as well. So did Morgan. Morgan joined in a little bit later. And we discussed these things. We also discussed the beginning of the coding period and sort of the expectations, at least for Barshan, which is to do a pull request weekly. Now, if you're not in the formal program, that's not a requirement, but I would suggest if you're going to participate in the open source group, if you're doing coding, to make regular pull requests and things like that. If anything, it's good practice. Barshan, I cross-posted or reposted one of his blog posts on our lab Medium, so the Orwell group Medium, and he has a new post now, Spatiotemporal AI and Graph Learning. Or actually, this is, the name of the post is Attention and Developmental Biology. And so this is, a collection of like 5 papers that, and, he went through them and discussed them in the context of his project, in the context of hypergraphs and things like that. Some interesting things if you're interested in attention mechanisms and in graph neural networks and maybe some of the spatiotemporal aspects thereof. Okay, so yeah, we had more discussion then, and Okarsh gave an update on his things, and Ashu gave an update on her things. Kavya asked a question about how to contribute, and he's interested in agent modeling, and so we might actually go over some of that today if we have time. I think we will. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then Jesse had some discussion about some project management issues, about how to sort of make decisions and organize things in a project. Jesse is very good at kind of getting at some of these big issues that maybe are very hard to articulate, but kind of getting your hands around them, especially in the world of project management. So if you're working in an organization and you have something happen, you can't quite put your finger on what it is. Jesse's probably talked about what that might be about. So it's very good stuff. So that's he's talking about here. And then I talked at the end of the meeting about this issue with AI generated pull requests in open source organizations. And so I presented 3 articles on this and just talking about the state of the art and how a lot of times contributors will use AI generated code to sort of address issues, or sometimes they'll create issues with an agent and they won't do their due diligence to make sure that the code works, or they don't want to, they don't understand all the code that they're writing. They make a commit, and then the maintainer who's accepting the pull request has a huge burden put on them to make sure that it's up to the standards of the org. So this is a problem, and sometimes this is not the fault of anyone. It's just that people are using tools and they don't necessarily know how to use them, nor do a lot of orgs really have really good worked out protocols and rules for them. So this is a problem. We had a little bit of this problem this spring with GSOC applications where people were submitting a lot of pull requests. And, even if you're not using AI, if you just get a lot of pull requests and an organization doesn't have the maintainer capacity for those pull requests, it can be a problem. And this is something that happens in organizations. A lot of open source organizations just don't have resources to deal with large volumes of pull requests, or sometimes organizations don't think about making rules that say, we'll only accept a few pull requests a month or something like that, which might help this problem of overflow, but it actually is a problem for open source because it does limit what we can do. It does limit sort of who can contribute or how they can contribute. And so that's another problem that you get as a side effect of this. And so there are all sorts of sort of disruptions to open source right now, related to AI agents, but also related to other things. Corporations are, kind of in it for themselves a lot of times. And there's, of course, always been the problem of people submitting bad work, out of scope work, or sometimes even malicious work. And so it's always up to the maintainer. And that's a weak link in a lot of open source organizations, not because maintainers don't do great work, but because it's just not something that a lot of orgs put a huge amount of resources into. So this is, a huge kind of problem in open source that needs to be sorted out. And, eventually there's going to be this, kind of solution that people come up with, maybe multiple solutions, but it's going to take some time. So that was our meeting. Okay, it looks like Jesse's joined us. Hello, Jesse.
Morning. I'll be able to speak more freely in 10 minutes or so. I'm here.
Yeah, no problem. And now Kavya wanted to know a little bit about our agent work, like I hinted at. And this is something that we do some of in open source sustainability. But there is another area where we do this more directly. And I think Jesse pointed Kavya to some of the work that's been done, but I wanted to walk through it a little bit and kind of talk about where we are with that work. If you go to our lab website, this is our lab website. It's orthogonalresearch.weebly.com. And if you go to people and collaboration, you'll see these tabs: simulating biology, neuro AI, open science, open source, and informatics. And so these are different groups and projects that we have linked from our main page. So we go to neuro AI, which is something that is sort of a catch-all term for what's going on here. It's kind of our approach to neuro AI. I have cognition futures under there, which is more about cognitive science. We talk a lot about, bleeds over into cybernetics. We talk a lot about agent cognition and other things like that in cognition futures. But we also have this group, representational brains and phenotypes, and I'm going to go to that website. So the way I have the groups in the lab is they all have their own website, or we try to get them, different websites. And the reasoning behind that is partially because we started out with DevoWorm, kind of separate from orthogonal lab, and then it kind of got integrated in. But we also then, want to have kind of every group have its own identity within the lab. So this is representational brains and phenotypes. This is sort of an illustration of what we're thinking about, these very simple models of cognition, of embodied intelligence, of those sorts of things, and building little toy models that can simulate those, simulate some sort of intelligent behavior. So we're not interested necessarily in things like large language models or machine learning models. We're interested in agent models, and not even really agent-based models. This is going a little bit beyond agent-based models, where you have agents that are sometimes embodied, sometimes they're not. They have an internal model where they have these representations, and it's the representations we're interested in. We might put them into a population. Oftentimes we're using something like genetic algorithms to, breed different populations of agents. Sometimes we're using embodied cognition principles where the agents have sensory inputs and they have effectors and they're doing things in the world, and it's continually updating that internal representation. Sometimes they're very abstract representations like our contextual geometric structures, and you see here kind of a reference to that. You'd have to read the paper to understand what's going on there, but basically those are quasi-embodied models that have these categories that where if you encounter something in the world, you categorize it in a certain way, and then you have this population of agents where you build a cultural representation of those things. So that's what we have. And then if we go to the interest areas, which is this tab up here, we have a couple of different subcategories for this group. So we have cultural computational modeling, growth and form, cybernetics and complexity, and agentive systems. So we go to cultural computational modeling. This is something that involves what we call contextual geometric structures. So there were a number of pieces of work that were done on that, papers, conference presentations, and other things. And then, of course, I worked with Hrishikesh Kulkarni, and this was quite a while back now. This was before the pandemic, where we did a couple of papers on sort of using data science and machine learning to look at cultural things. And so this is, and then of course we have things that we presented at the Cultural Evolution Conference. And so there's a cultural evolution dimension to this as well. And so that's all kind of in this subheading. The idea here is that we build these cultural representations, very broadly defined. We usually have populations of agents, and it's not like a agent-based model where they have strict rules of interaction. A lot of times they live in a population, which means that they have common inheritance, there's mutation, there's recombination, there's reproduction, and then you have evolution over time. So a lot of times, we'll have maybe a population of 50 agents, and they'll all start with very similar representations because they are all part of the same small population. We might expand that where we have replication of the agents. And then, it might expand the population to maybe 1,000 agents. And then we have different things that happen to the representations over time as they reproduce. Sometimes they mutate. So sometimes we might have like a genetic algorithmic representation where we have things on a artificial chromosome, and we can mutate different parts of that representation, change them in a very targeted way. Sometimes we have recombination where things get recombined across agents or across parts of the representation. So, that's an important part of cultural evolution, is this recombination process. You have transmission where things are transmitted from one agent to another or from one generation to another. So if there's a replication event, the descendants all get things from the parent. And it's very much a computer science problem as well as a genetics problem. So this is, but we're thinking about this in terms of cultural evolution, where you might inherit ideas or you learn ideas from an elder or from a parent. So these are all things that, we kind of build cultural representations with a certain level of abstraction, or we've also done work where we've looked at different things going on with, like, in data sets of books or in some psychological phenomena. So that's cultural computational modeling. We haven't really been as active in that recently, but it's something that we have an interest in. And there's this thing, growth and form. So this is a subgroup. This is where we do work on what we call computational critical periods and morphogenesis, proprioception, and soft materials. So computational critical periods and this morphogenesis, proprioception, and soft materials, these are links. Actually, this is a link to a Discord chat, and this is a link to actually one publication. This is the publication that I did with Richard Gordon and Jesse, and this was published in 2023. This was Embodied Cognitive Morphogenesis is a Route to Intelligent Systems. So we have this this work in sort of the area of agent morphogenesis, which is where we develop and grow agents using different methods. So it's very much tied into DevoWorm. It's very much a developmental approach, but it's this idea that you're evolving cognition and the body together, or you're rather developing it. It's actually maybe a more accurate way to put it, because there is some evolutionary aspects to it, but it's largely a developmental process that we're simulating. So this is a paper on different methods for doing this. But we also have, and I'm going to go to the publications for this group because that's where everything is. All sorts of different types of experiments and different sort of approaches that kind of develop for posters and for different white papers. So, thinking about development and how to model development, there was this work that was done over a series of Dynamics Days conferences where I looked at the modeling of heterochrony, or changes that unfold over time in development, where you control the timing and you control the rate. And this is something that happens in biology through genetic action, where certain things start growing at a certain time, and then in different species they grow at different times, and they start growing earlier or later depending on how this, how that population ends up evolving. So if something starts growing earlier, that means that maybe you can have a bigger brain, or you can have a bigger structure. That's whatever structure is growing, it gets bigger because it's been growing longer. If it starts later, it doesn't grow as fast, and it's smaller in the adult form. And then, of course, you have rate, so you can vary the rate as well. So it might start growing later, but it grows at a faster rate. So all these things have consequences for the adult phenotype And, that's something that we can model mathematically pretty well. And so we can apply that to these developmental agents where you have these developmental processes that you're trying to simulate. We have other types of models. We also have these phylogenetic models of embodied agents. This is something that just came out in the embodied cognition proceedings, where we're thinking about how we can evolve different agent phenotypes using the principles of phylogenetics. That means that we're thinking about the what things are shared between lineages of agents, common ancestry, and what kinds of things evolve sort of in parallel. And so this is more of like how do we evolve different agents to do different things, but how do we also generate some sort of quasi-natural diversity amongst agents? In other words, how can we generate a variety of agents to do maybe different types of things? So if you wanted to, say, evolve an agent to do things like open a bottle or open a jar, you would have to evolve a hand that could grip at the right strength and twist. And you could evolve that phenotype and you could optimize it. You could use an evolutionary algorithm and you could optimize it. But you could also, kind of do that process, but do it in a phylogenetic way. And you generate a bunch of variants on that task. So you don't necessarily try to always design things with an eye towards the optimal solution. You generate a lot of diversity, and then you evaluate the diversity. And ultimately, you have much more interesting designs or much more interesting structures than you otherwise would have. And so I don't want to get too much into that, but that's kind of what that's about. We have this paper again, Embodied Cognitive Morphogenesis. Then you have critical periods in developmental neurosimulation. This is the work we've been doing on critical periods. So again, it's about timing and development. Critical periods are periods of time where organisms acquire information. And so a lot of times with critical periods or sensitive periods, an organism will acquire something. And it's, sometimes if they acquire something during that time, has more of an effect on its adult form or a larger effect on sort of its learned behavior than if you present it at another time. So our visual systems have critical periods early in development where the eyes have to be in place and it has to acquire light, or else certain parts of visual cortex aren't fully developed. And so it's just these periods of time within development where things have to be in place. And this paper kind of goes through some of these scenarios. And then finally, we have this paper on dynamic representations of heterochrony, which I just discussed. So the cybernetics and complexity is actually a big area. This is part of this developmental AI roadmap. And this is where we have a couple of different things going on. We have this area of developmental neurosimulation, and this is where we have our Bradenburg vehicles. So we've really focused on Bradenburg vehicles for the most part. Got that wrong, but we're really focused on developmental Bradenburg vehicles for neurosimulation, building these embodied models, not just the traditional Bradenburg vehicle, which is here, but going from like a single cell or an egg, a Bradenburg egg or a vehicle egg, and then differentiating that egg into different, what they call germ layers, which differentiate into different structures like sensors and effectors, and an internal model, a brain, and then an outside shell, which is the body. And you have these different, these are encoded in a genetic algorithm or some other type of computational representation. And then you allow these things to develop, and then they develop into the adult form. And the idea is you can play around with the timing of things, you can play around with the acquisition of traits, and it has an effect downstream on the cognition of the agent later in life. So you could use this developmental technique to simulate, the different outcomes. So, the phenotype of Bradenberg vehicles, when Bradenberg developed this sort of paradigm, he was thinking about insects, but it was also kind of a toy model. He didn't really think about vehicles as being kind of anything more than kind of a very simple model for cognition. Well, we're taking this a couple steps further and saying, well, you could develop these embodied phenotypes, and you could put a lot of developmental detail into these simulations, and you could connect that with the adult phenotype and its behavior. So as it's acquiring a phenotype, it's also acquiring behavior. Well, it's happening in development, and that's kind of the idea behind developmental neurosimulation. I have the wrong figures for these papers, but we did a paper on intelligence offloading, and so we did some work on cognitive offloading and intelligence offloading, and these are again the wrong figures for this, but basically offloading is this phenomena where an organism will have some sort of cognitive representation, but instead of storing it in the brain, they store it in the environment. So if you're writing something on a piece of paper, if you're writing notes, that's offloading that knowledge to a notepad. And then you can go back and look at that notepad and recall what you said. So you're offloading some of that capacity to your notepad, and you're bringing that back into your mind, and it's reminding you of things. And it's this form of offloading that is very simple, because offloading can be much more complex. We have things like artifacts, symbolic artifacts, religious artifacts. Those are all things that sort of are offloaded into the environment. They serve as signals to people to remind them of things or to organize their thoughts. So these are all things. And then we talked about intelligence offloading in terms of these Bradenberg vehicles and other types of models developmentally as well. Then we also have some other things like this was something that Ankit Grover drove forward. He was interested in switching behaviors in cognition, and so we did a presentation on that at Neuromatch Academy. We've done a lot of work on Gibsonian information, which is characterizing information theory in terms of ecological principles or Gibsonian principles, which is basically drawn from ecological psychology and thinking about information as this process of gaining environmental structure and things like motion and other types of spatiotemporal information, and then integrating that in an agent. And then we just talked about embodiment and development a lot. And this is sort of all the work that we've been doing on neurosimulation. We also have allostasis machines, and I think Vidhi asked me for that one of these papers, as I sent the copy that I have to her. So allostasis machines is this idea that we create a simple model of allostasis. And allostasis is this phenomena where we have multiple stable states. And we have a system that moves between those stable states. And it has to find them in a dynamical environment. So as you know, homeostasis is where you have a simple model of equilibrium where you perturb the system and it returns to the target, right? It's like your body temperature, because you're homeothermic, you always have a constant body temperature. Sometimes you have a fever, sometimes you become hypothermic, and that core temperature drops, but it always returns to an equilibrium point. In allostasis, you have multiple set points, and oftentimes after you get perturbed or you experience a perturbation, that state drifts around but it finds a new stable state. So that's what an allostasis machine is. It's where an agent goes through the world and it's experiencing the world dynamically, and it has some sort of state readout that is constantly changing and shifting, and it's always trying to find stable states. So it's always returning to some baseline, but there are multiple baselines. And the idea is that you can have this sort of, so it's very much drawn from dynamical cognition, which we've talked about, where the system is always trying to find stable states given this sort of inherent perturbation filled world. So that's kind of the idea. And then we've just kind of had a couple of papers on that. We presented at SIGCHI and at the BICA conference. And so these are the publications. And then finally, we have this metabrain models approach. And this is mostly Jesse and myself worked on this. And this is where we have these neural representations that have multiple layers. And so the layers refer to different levels of abstraction or of representation. So, if you think about neural networks, they're practically representation free, meaning that they don't really have a high degree of symbolic representation to them. They just process data, you get a weight matrix, and that's it. A symbolic model, on the other hand, has a very high degree of symbolic representation, but a very low degree of sort of statistical representation. And so we, array those things in sort of layers, and the layer, so, something will be processed at one layer and then selectively passed on to the next layer, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of like different layers in neocortex or different parts of the brain where you get processing in, with one sort of, at one level of representation, and then you move down to the next layer and so forth. So this is like it kind of grew out of this idea of the neurosymbolic model, where you're combining sort of neural networks in symbolic models. But it's much more flexible, and we've actually talked about this in the context of agent-based modeling and in developmental agents. So this is very much tied to all the other stuff we're doing. Then finally, we have the agentive systems. These are things where, we've been thinking about this idea of intelligent agents, and actually we've kind of clustered some open source sustainability stuff under this, but it's kind of its own thing, where we're thinking about intelligence augmentation and intelligent agents and super performance and things like that. So I wanted to go over that website because I think it's a little, actually probably quite confusing if you don't know what's going on at all. So I do have, there is a lot of stuff there. Now we do have repositories as well, and I can point you to the repositories. We do have like a repository for the work we did with developmental Brainberg vehicles. We have some other repositories in metabrains and things like that. So those are, also probably need to be updated. And it's just always this task of continually updating, not only make sure that the right publications and presentations are in the right place, but also kind of thinking about the broader scheme. Like, how does this all fit together? And like I said, I need to go back and redo our roadmap for developmental AI and really kind of make that shine through. I haven't had a lot of focus on that aspect of it, but we'll have to come back to that. So that's what we have for the agent stuff, and it's very much different from like what we're doing in open source sustainability, although there's some related parts as well.
It's a very interesting moment in the potential sort of rebirth, or that's a little too theatrical, A number of things are happening right now that are interesting space to watch. It has been essentially a dormant period in the lab for a while. But for context that folks may not have, the Cognition Futures reading group and Cybernetics reading group, things we've had in the past, are attempting to restart in some form. The first meeting will be Wednesday at noon, basically here, in this. It may not always be in the S&M room Jitsi page, but that's where we're just to get things going. We're going to do that. That has come about in part because of Amanda Nelson's return, who is a longtime contributor in the past, a core centerpiece to Cognition Futures stuff. And it's kind of interesting because I met with her, was it this week or last week, to kind of check up about all that. And it led to this discussion like, hey, Bradley, hey, Morgan, can we meet, blah, blah, blah. Amanda is, it's kind of interesting because it's sort of like picking up almost exactly where we left off a while ago. We looked at some of the old notes. Some of our old notes for Cognition Futures reading group were like, it was a snapshot of 111's paper with the 1943 chart. It was like Cognition Futures 81. So we had almost 100 sessions of this reading group, or hybrid reading group. No, they're probably the original one. It sort of merged into a cybernetics focus at some point, but it's the same broad activity ultimately. So that may be starting up again soon. Well, that will be starting up again soon in some form. And Amanda is, what I appreciate about Amanda is Amanda really wants to focus on the cognitive science part of it and is not needing to go deeply into everything's right now is about LMs, right? And she's like, that's nice, but I want to actually just deal with like cognition in and of itself, not at the expense of it per se, but like focusing on cognition, psychology, philosophy behind it. So that's a nice. I appreciate that very much because it's one, I know that she's adapted that, and two, I think it's kind of a nice approach in the moment that we're in. And then of course, like, you know, doesn't mean the whole group's going to only do that, but it's just that's part of things. Beyond that, Avery, who I think was mentioned, Avery was the reason why we're using the word allostasis machine somewhat is because of Avery's own contributions to that space. About 5 years ago was when that happened. Yes, actually, I remember now. I was going through some of this came about from the whole trying to find the best way to show this. The Neuromatch conference series was one of the spaces some of this work developed back when Neuromatch was originally a conference. There was like 4 or 5 of them in the pandemic era, really. And then like that 2020, 2021, maybe 2022. And I looked at, I'm trying to find a way to show this. Yeah, here's one. If I can show this on the screen. Okay, hold on a second. This is old and outdated, but it's fun to see again. If I can, here we go. Okay. This isn't even, I don't even know if this is like a very good one, but this is like, I remember talking about Avery about this approach that they were developing. So this was Avery and myself and then Jenny and Nick were part of Plot Twisters at the time. We were all in a sort of effective altruism research development kind of cohort. I guess the proper term now it would be it's a residency, because that's kind of understood. But it was a residency supported by effective altruism at the time. But it wasn't necessarily directly about this. We met there, and through our work in the lab and Avery's interest in allostasis and this sort of internal external regulatory stuff, this came about, and it led to the actual paper. I think Daniela was on the paper. The papers that Bradley mentioned. This is sort of like a deep cut, if you will. This is like we kind of thought about some stuff at the time. Avery was very interested in qualia. Avery's still interested in qualia. All this kind of stuff, right? So there was a couple things like this, and I'm trying to go back and sort of in the new Jeffrey website update, which is both an update and attempting to find some of this stuff that's like all over the place, and in my notes and old websites for me, part of the representational brain stuff, and it's just like, oh, so I'm trying to sort of do a scavenging and like treasure hunt, if you will, and it's working there, but where I'm going with this, and I don't. Do I have like 10 minutes to talk about a sequence of things, Bradley?
Yeah, great. Go for it.
Because this is a great segue into it. I guess before I go any further, did Vidhi or anybody else have any questions on what Bradley said? Because I'm kind of about to jump into a new thing, but we can talk about that if anybody has questions about that first.
There are a couple things in the chat. Let me look. Oh, okay. Yeah, thumbs up from Vidhi. We'll have a timely follow-up our allostasis machines, which we're kind of doing now. And then just as dynamical cognition will come up Wednesday for the next Cognition Futures reading group session. So, yeah, it's all kind of in the same theme. There's a lot of overlap in different ways. So I think that's, it's kind of in that theme of cognition and then going to agents and then bridging that, but not doing it where we're kind of obsessed with large language models and machine learning. So I guess that's the way to put it.
Yeah. And I'm pulling up something to show, but basically to try to talk about it. It's been really interesting because this is sort of like, it's kind of funny, like, just to zoom out all the way and have a meta like historical perspective. This is why documentation and whatnot matters, because it's very likely in your career, especially if you're like seriously interested in making things or pushing ideas or exploring ideas and doing some, I would call it like deeper work or theoretical work. Not theoretical. I mean, like, I call it, I don't know this is really a fair term. I call it theory work, and not necessarily theoretical, like theoretical astrophysics, theoretical biology. I mean theory work as in like you're contending deeply with the nature of how some ideas emerge. And what I'm getting at is I'm referencing stuff from 5 years ago or 2 or 3 years ago, because Avery and Amanda are two key players in our research groups, plural, and both together they've had some overlap and not, but perhaps serendipitously somewhat, or just I've been talking to Avery quite a bit about things in a more academic way since, I don't know, 7 months really. But Amanda has just appeared back on the scene. And so now it's like these two huge collaborators appear, and suddenly this stuff that's just been lying on the shelf for a couple of years, like no one's really mentioned allostasis machines, right? Or even, it's just but now it's here again. So it's sort of like kudos to us for, at the very least, maintaining some of these things so that way we could pick it up. Like going back and seeing, I don't think I can find it here. Yeah, it's not going to come up for me. But going back and seeing the notes of our notes on the Creation Futures rating groups and the sessions, even though it was such a pain to maintain them in like the Notion space for a while, or the stuff on GitHub, or just the documents or whatever. It's like, oh, like it's such a nice. It's like coming back to a place where you built up a treasure trove of some sort, and you can now kind of do it again. So good on that. To go to some of the newer stuff, there's no description on this page, but it is a thing. This is very new, and this is something from the website. There's no description here yet, but that's okay. We kind of reference this old phenomenology thing here, and it's kind of related here. But this is sort of the latest version that Avery's looking at now. And this is in development big time. It's mostly through, I mean, Avery's mostly been involved in our group, which still somewhat meets Friday nights. I actually met last night, which is partly why I'm talking about this, about the Diginest group. But what Avery's trying to do is get at, Avery's playing around with this, and I don't know how to do a great job of explaining it, but Avery's basically trying to look at differences, in the simplest way, let's say differences in information processing amongst agents. And that's always been, that goes all the way back to, like if you go back to this, like part of Avery's ideas, if I could speak to them very loosely, is that what this looks like for agents, including individual humans, is not uniform. Like there are different ways, different weights, different preferences, different ways that this would happen. So that's essentially what Avery's getting at. Now, if I can, I want to show something incredibly recent, less than 16 hours ago, but it's how could I show it? We recorded. We weren't gonna meet at all last night, but then we got delayed, and I'm like, hey, we'll just talk. And we had a very simple. We're having a nice conversation. Like, I should try to record this. So I just basically got an incredibly simple recorder and recorded our talk. But as you may find yourself, like you'll hear about things like many times, oh, the most important part of a conference is not the main event, it's this conversation you have in the hallways type thing, or out to dinner, or you're like, hey, you meet somebody and you walk away and then like, oh, hey, remember that thing you said? So this is essentially what happened there. And we said like, okay, well, I'm going to call it a jam session, because that's really what it was. And I'm also loosely inspired by a jazz tribute to Miles Davis that I was at recently, which was cool. But here, I'll do it like this. Oh, sorry, this is playing. I'll just play it. I'll share this. This is it's going to remain mostly unreleased, but just to give a preview of it, the title we had was like Asymmetrical Minds, Specialization Correction, Why Strong AI Feels Short. That's sort of a nice title summarizing a variety of things. But in it, we talk about things like asymmetrical. Asymmetry has been coming up a lot in our complexity-related discussions, David Krakauer type things, and also Levin, of course. That's kind of been a recent theme here. Different kinds of, if you will, information or information processing, which is sort of a strange term, and the role of an individual's ability to process information relative to its sort of social group or groups around it. I threw in some classics of of the past. Oops, I just lost my thing, including the genomic bottleneck, because we had which is this sort of term, I think, by Anthony Zador, and just this concept of, you know, what I think about, how, like, ways to explain what we're getting at is like you don't think about limiting your arm at 180 degrees of an angle to, you know, your body, because the fullness of that for you, the complete of that to you in your sort of what you think about is heavily shaped by the development of the bones of the uh, the body's refining. Uh, there's a continuous buildup for why the decision space for that question should be limited, if you will. That's not really. Uh, Avery also brought up the example of like counter shading, like why many mammals have lighter bottoms and heavier tops, I believe it is, so that when you're looked at from the side, especially like in a predator prey sense, if you're looked at from the side, there's this visual compression. So you kind of seem there could be this sort of appearance of oops, I pressed the wrong button here, of sort of shrinking or being just harder to see. And again, it's not like you're thinking, oh, I really want my upper skin or feathers or whatever to be darker, so I'm gonna think about that. It's just uh, within the problem space of what you know colors should emerge. uh, there's a perhaps evolutionary benefit. Well, if these seem to be a little bit darker, maybe that's better. And there's the compounds over time about these things that are not necessarily direct, but there's a compound buildup of either a desired attractor or desired space or desired set of options or desired in the realm of the possibility space, something becomes favored over another, right? And we were talking about this in terms of how prioritizing certain information or certain strands of things as opposed to deprioritizing them can lead to, you know, what if put it this way, if a lot of Avery's ideas about let's say lopsidedness and non-homogeneity in information processing, if you will, um, is you know, if there's substance to that, what is its relation to things like, you know, you see culture or tribe, or like the broader extended or shared cognitive things of the species, of not necessarily species, but of the agent. Like it's not, there are things that perhaps cover or you know, it's a bit like kind of like the idea of specialization in economics. Like if you specialize here, other people could potentially specialize in other things, and there's certain surpluses that can be built and then traded. That's one approach to it. And I'm curious. I feel like there's an inevitable, and the Benjamin Lyons, who's doing a lot with econ and Lisa Feldman Barrett stuff and Levin, and Ben wrote a paper in the latest issue with our paper in Philosophical Transactions, Royal Society stuff with Levin. I feel like I would put a wager on something happening there in some form. Either Ben will discover certain things himself, or Avery will reach out and we'll do something. We'll see. And then finally, I'll mention very briefly, we talked about we've talked about the limitations of current AI, and you know, what would AGI look like considering XYZ, multi-agent systems. We talked about interesting things about archetypes, corrective information, and the 1943 Cybernetics paper, and how there's maybe a relationship to archetypical or at the very, and maybe less than archetypes here in this audience, if we could say sort of genomic bottleneck. What is the genomic bottleneck for certain cognitive things, for certain for cognitive structures? Which I don't like these terms, but to loosely lap them in, what is a genomic bottleneck like concept? And you say part of like cognitive offloading, or is it offloading? Is it domain space reduction? But that loose set of concepts, what is that in a sort of a cognitive space, or mind working to process information type space? And how is that all related to, what was this? Affordances and structural priors, and basically corrective information. We had a very nice part of the discussion that was about how this relates to the 1943 paper, behavior purpose theology, and essentially negative feedback. Like how is the relationship to some of those things, and the means by which negative feedback, and by negative feedback basically mean the distance to the goal, like the kind of reinforcement learning, but like where the ability to track from a goal state or goal destination, whenever, where, what is the gap, and how does what we're talking about here relate to that kind of how does it relate to that, let's say. So I will leave it at that. I don't know that I've recorded a thing, and it's currently sort of a private video. I've made it. It's one of the things that I'm very happy to have recorded, but I don't know that we'll share it in its current state, just because it's quite rough. And I didn't want to edit it out. But I have a large stack of like months of discussions that I'm hoping to actually release. And now that the website's mostly under control, the internship rush is mostly under control. Our big round of internships, we're still getting some more, but like data and direction internships are closed. I can't. There's no way to do any more now, and I'm reaching out. If someone's watching this for whatever reason and you haven't been contacted yet, that's okay. We haven't finalized everything, but we're definitely not taking any more applications now. So don't be worried about that. But decision will be out soon. But just like now that all this stuff is happening, I feel like okay, I'm finding better ways to produce some of the, maybe release some of the content that we have been building up. So yeah, that's pretty much it. But it's been a very interesting moment to have the return of Amanda, who I really like how her mind works about a lot of things, and Avery's sort of been slowly building up this momentum and doing more and more and more public facing stuff. So I'm very happy for them to do that. Avery has a Substack also, but I don't think they've really written that much yet. And I keep saying, hey, why don't I'm encouraging the writing of things. So if there's time later, I'll mention something else that I recently wrote as well. That's pretty tangential to this, so not important. But yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. So yeah, this is I haven't been keeping up with the developments at Avery, and yeah, it's good. Looks good. Looks like they're making some pretty good progress. Yeah. So, well, looking forward to the Wednesday session. Looks like Kavya has to leave. Thank you for attending.
Avery may be able to make it, but I think you and Morgan and Amanda and me are solid, or at least at least heavily intended upon all making it then. So that's as much as you can ask for.
Yeah, looking forward to attending and seeing what's new. So it looks like you're pushing things within JoPro on like cognition futures. I mean, do you have kind of a roadmap on how you want to get back to things and the things you want to? Because I remember a long time ago we had this paper pyramid, which
Yes.
We did realize one. I know. So
that's kind of what I would like to talk about Wednesday, because it's interesting to see. It's like Amanda kind of is like right where we left off, which I'm happy to do. I'm interested in those things, but I also have some new ground. If I was, I'll put it this way: if I was to just restart Cognition Futures right now, or it doesn't even. That's not really a fair way to say it. Maybe a better way to say it is, if I was to recreate or create, it doesn't have to be if I was to make a raging group or discussion group right now in the Cognition Futures domain, what it would focus on would probably be about navigation and selection. One, I guess, to be fair, some of Avery's stuff, like the allostasis, the non-homogeneity of processing certain information, that's a major thing that I'm interested in. But Avery's a heavy theory idea person with their own stuff there that's been brewing for years. I think it's fair to say decades, honestly, now. So I'm hoping that some of it will come out, right? So I wouldn't necessarily lead that, but I would definitely support it. I'm particularly interested in this sort of navigation. One of my pitches for Dizzy, the diverse intelligence school thing, was about one of the themes, like common currencies, and I wanted to look into my submission for them, which I'm currently waitlisted for, is about navigation and like common currencies of navigating things, both from different agents, physical spaces, but also epistemic spaces as well. Like what are I don't want to say unifying principles, but what are overlaps there? Can it serve as a common currency or not? Looking at it from that lens, and I'm interested in that both in a classic, how does it work? How does the mind part of the thing work? But also have a much broader project as well about the identification and selection. I think those are my core themes right now. Like, these are almost meta science, or I don't really know what to call the approach that I'm taking, to be honest with you. It can be philosophy, it could be meta science, it could be something about strategy. There's a cognitive component, but essentially, broadly, the concepts of identification, selection from choices, acknowledgement of alternatives, or not acknowledgement, but like the means by which an alternative can be identified or comprehended, I think, is a fair way to say it. How does that relate to affordances? How does that relate to all the many sort of cognitive related topics we've been talking about? Like, that for me is like absolutely this is a strange analogy, but it's like, that's definitely a big bad in the background that is dominating the fictional universe of my cognitive science interests. That's looming in the back for me about many, 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 many things. Okay. So how does that square with Amanda's interests and like the paper, like dynamical cognitive science, the Raja paper? Like, Amanda was really excited, like, oh, Raja's writing this another interesting paper from him. And how does that, like, I would love to start, I think that's the first paper we're going to read or go over again somewhat. Or we talked about going through our world models paper, and I don't know if we did that sufficiently or not. And then the Raha paper was Amanda's edition too. So somewhere between those things, which is slightly different, but and sort of the Raha paper is like, where art thou? And maybe a little throwback to our classic, what happened in cognitive science. by Rafael Nunez, and that, I'm sure there's some relation between those, spiritually at least, and I don't know. I think that's sort of our starting, like the start of the Dungeons and Dragons Critical Role. We're all going to meet at the inn and talk about that, and then we'll see where we go. The adventure takes us from there, but there's definite leans that I have, and I would the paper pyramid of years past. It's still there. Like I think I pretty much know where it is in Notion. I think I know what it is. I don't know. Maybe that's something we can discuss Wednesday. Is like, hey, like here's kind of what we thought a long time ago. What's interesting to us now? I think that's administratively, that's probably what I will attempt to do in the meeting somewhat. So I don't know if you have any particular thoughts or leans or other comments about all that.
Well, yeah, I like this. I didn't know that's what you had done for Dizzy, was this common currencies for navigation. So, yeah, I mean, and part of that is because, if you're dealing with like spatial cognition versus something like navigating an epistemic space, there are different mechanisms, but it also is worth thinking about, how we kind of map between them. Like, for example, oftentimes in computing, we've used or sort of we maybe conflated spatial navigation with epistemic navigation. So, like if you have a folder system, it's in a graphical user interface. It's in a desktop or in a file system, and you'll navigate through that. And it's spatial, and it's epistemic, and it's also sort of structural. In other words, you think about it in terms of its location in a space, and so it's like you have to have this somewhat common currency. I mean, it's not going to be like a one-to-one mapping, but it's going to be like you're translating between a set of ideas in space. And a lot of times, like people, if you have a lot of research topics, for example, you might organize your files in that way. Like, okay, I have this file at the bottom of my list, and I always go there and I pick it and go in there. And so you're used to, and you can find it more easily. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I'd be interested to see like kind of what the outcome of that is.
Well, we'll see. It's not. It was something that I kind of synthesized a lot of ideas. It's not. It's like I don't have ongoing research about it or anything in a substantial way. But if I get in and can talk about that there, I'd love to do that. And I think to kind of bridge from the last night's jam session, what was interesting, we touched upon. In the same way that a GUI makes it sort of easier to, it's sort of more recognizable to how the user, which is a human being in this case, would prefer to do this stuff. Right. In reality, is your downloads folder, this far away on a 2D space,
right,
relative to like your desktop folder? No. And I think that's both something we really take for granted, but also like it's thinking very deeply about, and I don't want to veer off into the, can a neuroscience understand a transformer or like a processor or whatever? I don't want to go that's very important too, but really thinking deeply about like there's a certain particular level of just complete abstraction that's happening to, we're going to make a graphical user interface that is relevant to where in a structure, like we're presenting the structure in a different way. But sort of how much from which side. Oh, this I'm trying to reference. This came up in a meeting too, and I don't know. I think this is a press digitness meeting. But how much? Yeah, how much from which side of, it's sort of like front end, like website front end, if you will. Maybe that's a fair way to say it. Like your website front end is tailored to very specific visual navigation, whatever, and the back end is a bunch of folders, maybe. And how, like, which of the poles there are, and like, you have to account for that. The common currency isn't, it's sort of the awareness of which level of thing is being looked, from which end is it being looked at, and then where is I don't want to say, I feel cringy saying the word emergent here,
Yeah.
but where's the thing that makes it great from one view or not? And what I'm, that I have very poor words for this right now, and it's disappointing, but the element of, I think if there is a common currency around it, it has to do with something around the, I don't want to say affordance perception here really, but I think it's a very interesting space to look at how are options or alternatives comprehended or made available. There's also I just remember this now. There's also part of the Dizzy thing that was sort of ethical implications as well of, I don't know, diverse intelligence. My proposal was it was a bit aspirational, but it was about common currencies, and I think also how I tied it in ethics somehow. I don't remember it in the moment, which is just fine because I've been doing so much of this stuff. But it was interesting. I'll leave it at that. I clearly don't have full command of it in the moment to represent it very well. But we'll see where it goes, and then maybe it. I would appreciate, I'm really curious on Wednesday. I think it'd be nice if both, we can go over some papers, but if Amanda has a project like she did, like, I have this one here. I could pull this up. A long time ago, Amanda did this. She presented this at one of the embodied intelligences, I think. But she did embodied neurophenomenology, and this is like I basically was able to salvage this from the old web page, and like this is Amanda's thing. That probably maybe shouldn't be there, but this was certain thing she presented at one of the embodied intelligence ones. Yeah, EI 23. And I don't know, like I would love to encourage her to be like, hey, like, we don't have to work on the same project, obviously. And I think that's true for everybody here. We all know that. But like, if there's something you want to work on, if there's a project you want to work on and you'd like to see it develop, then, say it. We want to give you as much opportunities to grow in a project leadership sense as possible. So I don't know if Amanda wants to work on that entirely, or wants to just kind of, my sense for her, and I won't speak for her more than this, is I think she kind of wants to kind of pick up where she left off, and I think she's sort of getting her feet wet a little bit. Amanda's a very capable person, a formidable mind about these things, but I think she just wants to kind of, okay, let's get in talking about it again and build from there. I have some project ideas in mind. I don't know, Morgan was quite enthusiastic about some things in the last meeting, and I don't know if, like you, Bradley, where you want to go with stuff. But we can talk about that Wednesday, but that's my general take on. I think we'll be reading some stuff together, and then we may have some slightly different like projects. And we can talk about a broader paper pyramid for the whole group, or more discrete project trajectories. So
Right.
yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Well, yeah, thank you, Jesse. That was good. Good to revisit a lot of that and think about where that's going to go in the future and all that. Yeah. And then,
Yeah. Oh, and like I should. Yeah. Like, and if Avery's there, Avery has of research thrusts of their own.
Yeah.
So I would love to have everybody in the room and see what comes from it, because I'm sure it'll be interesting.
And then there's this whole thing about reconstituting cognitive science or cognition, because we're talking about dynamical systems and world models, so people are kind of coming up with new concepts and what that would look like. So we've talked about the hexagon, the cognitive systems hexagon, and that's just kind of one model where it just kind of touches on 6 fields, and those fields, of course, are always changing. So that's always, that's a model that came out of, I think, the 50s originally. So it's kind of like those fields that are in the hexagon have changed quite a bit. And there are probably new fields that have kind of, found their way into cognitive science. And, there's more of a focus on some fields than other fields. So it's like, we have to kind of characterize that space, and that's something else we're interested in too with cognition futures. And I don't know, I kind of always come back to that model because it's always so useful to think about how we think about a field that we're working in, or how we think about concepts and how those change.
Did I mention here, because like what you said is sort of an allusion to, I don't remember if I mentioned it here or not. I mentioned it to Amanda, and it kind of slipped my mind now. But it was essentially how this is, I think, some of the things we were looking at a long time ago, but put in contemporary language of. I had a. Did I make anything of this? But just sort of looking at, referencing it, sort of cognitive science 1.0 as sort of like the classic 60s hexagonal cognitive science with a particular take on computation, and computation is supposed to be this both modeling feature and like a method, and it was supposed to be, in a sense, computation, maybe this is unfair to say, but computation and the computer and sort of this, I don't know if maybe you're trying to say implication that your mind is a computer, like that. There's a certain version of cognitive science that is outdated now, that was kind of the thing, like that the project was sort of, oh, now that we have computation, blah 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 blah, and this way. And I think I might have mentioned, I don't remember if I mentioned it here to you in one of these meetings or not, but just sort of a look on, I think I did mention it, yeah. I was sort of like something about like, oh, now like with LMs replacing that sort of, not just computation, but sort of the implications of LMs, and where are we now in a modern sense relative to that project, and what, there was something there that I might have mentioned before, but I don't recall. It might have been like a month ago at this point, so I don't know. Anyway, that's more for me to think about ahead of next meeting than anything to discuss now, probably.
Yeah, that's good. All right, well, we move on to, I have a couple things I want to present on. So the first thing I want to present on is, if we go back to our paper that we did for world modeling and the Evergood regulator theorem, and you're familiar with the Evergood regulator theorem, which maybe some of you are and some of you aren't, you'll know that one of the things about the Evergood regulator theorem is that it's about good regulation. So what does it good mean? It's such a subjective term. So in the paper, we kind of talk about what good is in the context of a world model, but also what good is in terms of, so is good optimal? Is good good enough? Is good conforming to the things you want? Or is good the ability to deal with perturbations or disruptions, or robustness, as we might call it in engineering? So there are a lot of things that are kind of subsumed under this term good. And Conant and Ashby, who are the people who developed DGRT, they weren't explicit about what good means, it's just that it's good. It does something, it's desirable. And so that's, maybe led to problems in terms of applying the ever-good regulator theorem. But there is one sort of concept that is very important for the regulator, as opposed to, we have good, which means, I guess, optimal or adaptive or robust, anything that helps you keep regulation stable. And then the other concept is variety. So variety is, it's not actually, it's a little less subjective than good, because we actually know that variety is when you have a diversity of things, or when you have many different things that you're trying to deal with. And variety is sort of one of the keys to being good at regulation. And in fact, cognitive science hasn't really incorporated this idea of variety. It's, cognitive science, a lot of times, if you deal with something like attention, or you deal with something like memory, or you deal with something like some of the other areas that cognitive scientists think about, they often think of a very homogeneous model. And it's like, an idealized model, or something where variety is not important. And of course, but we know that the world is full of variety, right? You have varieties of things. And that's, in fact, one of the key aspects. We think about it sort of as a implicit thing. One of the key aspects of machine learning. If you have a training set that has, say, cars, you want to train your model on as many different types of cars as possible, so that model can generalize. If you train it all on the same car, it'll recognize that car, and then if it sees something different, it won't recognize it as a car. It'll reject that prediction, and you'll have an error. So your model in that case is only as good as the variety that you have. If you have more variety, if you have a greater amount of variety, then the more generalizable your model. And thus it is with human categorization as well, or animal categorization, where you have, if you're introduced to a wide variety of different varieties of a type, if you think about it in that way, or maybe a category. So if you only saw one type of car, you would see other types of car as maybe not a car. Or this happens a lot in cultural categorization, where you make distinctions between different things based on sort of their importance or their functionality or something like that. So sometimes, some cultures have 50 different words for like snow, or like a certain type of fruit or whatever, and other cultures can make do with just one word for that same thing, because they have it's a different sort of level of importance. They make distinctions between the varieties, and those varieties are important. Sometimes they're less important. If they're less important, that's fine, but then you can't make those kind of distinctions from sort of nothing. You have to have the cultural toolkit available to you. So variety plays a really important role in regulation, in cognition, and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about variety as it stands in cybernetics, and then I'm going to talk about this paper that is about requisite complexity, which is, or actually another paper, that's the second paper, and then I'm going to talk about a new paper that sort of formalizes variety as a mathematical concept, and it's kind of taking off on Conant and Ashby's work. So let's do the first one here. This is the Wikipedia article on variety, parentheses, cybernetics. So, this is kind of the cybernetics treatment of variety. So in cybernetics, the term variety denotes the total number of distinguishable elements of a set. So this is basically, if you know anything about information theory, it's very closely aligned with how information is thought of in information theory. So in information theory, we usually have an ensemble, which is a set, and then we have different states, and we measure those states. We measure the distribution within that ensemble, and we get our information. If our ensemble contains a bunch of things that are in the same state, then we have a very low level of information. If we have a bunch of different states in our ensemble, we have a very high level of information. Phrased in terms of variety, variety is high information, and a lack of variety is low information. So that's how they think about variety. It's very tied to information theory, and in fact, it probably did come from Shannon's conception of information theory. So this is all kind of intellectually connected. So, yeah, in fact, they say here variety is used in cybernetics as an information theory that is easily related to deterministic finite automata, and less formally as a conceptual tool for thinking about organization, regulation, and stability. But in the EGRT, of course, we're using variety as that latter thing. So, yeah, W. Ross Ashby developed the term variety to extend his analysis of machines to their set of possible behaviors. Ashby says the word variety in relation to a set of distinguishable elements will be used to mean either A, the number of distinct elements, or B, the logarithm to the base 2 of the number, in the context indicating the sense used. So it's basically information theory at base 2, log base 2. And, we're thinking, I guess, about bits in this case. So that's why we're doing the base 2. So, we're measuring variety in bits. So, again, like I said, if your machine has states A, B, C, D available to it, and you get a sequence A, B, C, 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 D, then that sequence A, B, C, 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 D has a variety of 4. And it's just taking all the available states and it's generating a sequence and it's seeing how many of those states are represented in the sequence and at what probability. So it's basically information theory. And then the same things about information theory hold true for the measurement of that variety. And now, this next part, since the number of distinguishable elements depends on both the observer and the set, so it's actually the other bring in the observer, the second order cybernetics. The observer and his powers of discrimination may have to be specified if the variety is to be well defined. So this is, again, being able to see variety and classify it correctly and have categories for the variety. So if we had no, distinction between different shades of blue, we might just put all different shades of blue in one category. And thus you have less variety in terms of blue, you have fewer states, and so there's not as much of a distinction between those states, even though there's an underlying variety. So if you think about this computationally, it's like the difference between sort of a fixed automata and some sort of hidden Markov model where you're trying to find new states or hidden states. So this is a problem of hidden state, where the observer or the person who's classifying things doesn't have the classes, or the classes they have hold a bunch of different types of things within them. So there's variety within those states so that can be unlocked. And so this is a problem where, again, if we think about this in the real world, some cultures have many different words for, say, like different types of snow or different shades of blue, whereas other cultures don't. And so those cultures with all those different terms have unlocked that variety, and they can take advantage of it. So that's kind of thinking about the basic aspect of variety, and then talks about the different laws, because they like to create laws around things in cybernetics. The law of experience and the law of requisite variety. The law of experience refers to the observation of the variety of states exhibited by a deterministic machine in isolation cannot increase. Then the set of identical machines fed the same inputs cannot exhibit increasing variety of states and instead tend to synchronize. So this is almost like kind of describing what we might call nowadays model decay, where if you have a model upstream, you have a certain number of states available to it. Like, so say we do like a machine learning problem where we have someone who trains a model, and then that model maybe trains another model, or things get passed from that original model downstream to other models. The original model is where all the variety is kind of defined, and then the subsequent models are constrained sort of by that categorization of variety. So it can't generate new variety. If it does, maybe it hallucinates and it's, kind of useless because it's not operating on any sort of principle. So upstream is where all the variety is created, and ultimately that's due to the observer, who's the person who's creating the states in the first place. Now, it's an interesting question as to, like, if you had a generative model, whether or not you could create new variety based on patterns in the data. And of course, we do that with machine learning because we do try to find hidden states or try to find relationships between things. And that is kind of uncovering some of this hidden variety. But the law of experience basically says that you have sort of this experience with variety, and you can't just kind of feed a machine variety and expect to get more variety out of it. There's a tendency to synchronize around the same sort of answer. So this is what they call a decay of variety. So a deterministic transformation cannot increase the variety of a set. As a result, an observer's uncertainty about the state of the machine either remains constant or decreases with time. So this is, again, the observer kind of gets to know the machine, or the system kind of gets to know the variety, and it sorts things into these categories, and it becomes more predictive over time. But sometimes that, if you don't make the correct assumption of variety in the first place, there's a lot of hidden variety that gets subsumed under that. So this has a lot of ties to machine learning and how we do, how we create labels, how we train our models, and things like that. It also brings up another set of questions about generative models and how it can create new categories for things or uncover things that we didn't really think about. So there are a lot of connections there. But so there's this law of experience, and then there's this law of requisite variety. So the law of requisite variety is that if you have a system and you have a regulator of that system, so say you have a regulator that wants to control, say, something with respect to a system's diversity or its variety. So say you have like a closed loop control. You might have like a brain machine interface where you have a brain that generates states, and you have a classifier that tries to classify those states. The brain having many more categories than the classifier, because you can only observe a certain set of states from the brain. That regulator then is limited in terms of how it can regulate the output. Some systems have this one-to-one mapping where they have every state available to it. So the regulator has every state that the system has, and that therefore that regulator can match the system at any given time. And that's what we call perfect regulation, meaning it can always respond in a like manner, and it's never like decoupled. The system and the regulator are never decoupled. But sometimes there are disturbances that occur. Sometimes there are states that are generated by a brain that a classifier can't match. And so in that case, the two things become decoupled and the regulation becomes not good. So that's kind of what requisite variety is, that the regulator, the thing that's trying to match the behavior of the system, doesn't have enough states or doesn't have enough information to get the right outcome or get a good outcome. And Ashby used a two-player game to model this, where one player is the disruption or the disturbance and another one is the regulator. So this is something that Ashby thought about a lot, and it's basically where you're trying to match the behaviors of something that you don't necessarily understand or is maybe stochastic. So this can be stated in bits of information theory. So it's very much tied to that. And then, of course, there's this Poisson McKelvey update to the law of requisite variety called the law of requisite complexity, which we'll look at in a minute. So this holds that in order to be efficaciously adaptive, meaning that it's good at being adaptive or something, the internal complexity of a system must match the external complexity it confronts. So if there's a lot of complexity in the world, your regulator must match that. And this happens to be very relevant to world models, because if we have a world model of a system for, like, say, a large language model or a machine learning model to draw from, that world model has to incorporate enough of the states of the world or the system to allow for those models to respond properly. That's kind of what we're getting at in our paper in terms of EGRT and world models, is that the world model is basically the thing that's going to match the state of the predictive state with the world, and it'd be a good surrogate for the world. So it's something that the model could draw from to become better at predicting things and representing information. So this is kind of thinking about this is also thinking about kind of moving this in the direction of complexity theory. And so this is where this law of requisite variety has gone. It's gone from sort of this set of experiments that Ashby was doing to a number of works by Stafford Beer and Frank George and other people, but also into the world of complexity theory. Okay. And of course, there's some other ties to like chaos theory and other things, but we won't talk about that. There are also ties to the Cybernetic project. Okay, so this is requisite complexity. This is a paper that was published, Foundational Papers in Complexity Science. Requisite Complexity, a contemporary view of cybernetic control and communication. This is by James Crutchfield, who's at Santa Fe. And the idea is that this paper, the ever good regulator of a system must be a model of that system, is very much rooted in information theory, but also is tied to nonlinear dynamics. And there isn't as much emphasis on that in Ashby's work, but is important nonetheless for that area. In this way, connecting the original historical effort to the modern, today's complex systems research can be appreciated as a revival and extension of Norbert Wiener's cybernetics. So that's interesting. That cybernetics is sort of the precursor of complexity theory, or one of them. So, I think this is just a summary of the paper. This is an excerpt. So, basically, thinking about this idea of the law of requisite variety, we're thinking about that in terms of complex systems and how we can characterize those. And then they kind of bring up et.al's work in chaotic dynamics and Cross and Greenside's work in self-organization. And so these are These come to mind as example of emergent phenomena that make complex systems supremely challenging, and it's a restatement essentially of the Evergood regulator theorem, and that you have a system that's very complex, that's hard to understand, that's maybe incomplete in terms of its understanding. So in chaos theory, as well as in emergence, we have a system that does something that we can't say for sure exactly how it happened. We can only sort of approximate the process by which something happened. And the same thing probably holds true for a regulator that doesn't have access to every state of a system. So that regulator is us, as the observer, trying to explain what that system is doing. We don't have access to every state, but we can just kind of describe that process in terms of the states we have available to us. So that that description is lossy in the sense that it's not a perfect map, but we can do well enough to at least describe it, hopefully. We can do that with mathematics, but the mathematics is incomplete. We can do that with simulation, but simulation doesn't give us the exact rules of what's happening. So that's kind of a nice connection between complexity theory and the Evergood regulator theorem. And then the third paper I want to talk about here is this paper by Alexander Siegenfeld and Unir Bar-Yam. And this is on a formal definition of scale-dependent complexity and the multi-scale law of requisite variety. So they are actually updating the law of requisite variety for complexity theory, or for use in sort of a complex systems setting. This is from the journal Entropy. So the abstract reads, Ashby's law of requisite variety allows a comparison of systems with their environments, providing a necessary but not sufficient condition for system efficacy. A system must possess at least as much complexity as any set of environmental behaviors that require distinct responses from the system. However, to account for the dependence of a system's complexity on the level of detail or scale of its description, so we have different scales of description. We have a coarse grain scale, a fine grain scale, a finer grain scale. And because we have those differences of scale, we have differences of the number of states that are used to describe something. So if you look at something in a coarse grained approximation, you don't have all the states available to you, but you can approximate them. In a fine-grained system, you have access to those states, and you can give a more refined description, but you also need access to that coarse-grained scale, maybe to describe things like emergence. So we wanted to have a multi-scale generalization of Ashby's law, because remember, we want to have this regulator interact with the system, but the regulator can't just simply be at one scale or another. We need to have a regulator that can operate on both scales, on the coarse grain scale and the fine grain scale. There are benefits to both, and we need that for something like describing emergence. We define a class of complexity profiles, which are complexity as a function of scale. That is the first, to our knowledge, to exhibit a multi-scale law of requisite variety. This formalism provides a characterization of multi-scale complexity and generalizes the law of requisite variety in a single constraint on a system, on systems behavior. So requisite variety is a single constraint. And this leads us to a class of multi-scale constraints. We show that these complexity profiles satisfy a sum rule, which reflects a trade-off between smaller and larger degrees of freedom. And we extend our results to subdivided systems and systems with a continuum of components. So again, this law of requisite variety means that our regulator needs to have access to all the states of the system. Now, of course, we maybe need to have access to both coarse grain and fine grain states, or the number of states that exist at different scales, which of course varies if you're dealing with something like an emergent system, or if you're doing something like a multi-scale system like say like a biological system where you have cells and you have a biochemistry, and you even have like a higher scale, like a set of populations or behaviors. So you need to be able to describe the states at all those scales, and your regulator needs to have access, or maybe you need to have multiple regulators that can deal with that. So that's what they're getting at. And then of course you have a lot of times in systems you have subdivided systems that interact. So sometimes you have modular systems where you have different parts of a system. So you're only maybe accessing one module of a system, and you need to access multiple modules to make sense of the system. Or you have a continuum of components where, and remember, Ashby conceptualized the Evergood regulator theorem as a discrete exercise where you're creating discrete states that are amenable to information theory. But sometimes you have a continuum of things where your states are continuous, which doesn't necessarily map well to that metaphor that he used from information theory, and you need other tools to be able to do that. So this is basically about scale-dependent complexity and how we deal with that with the Evergood regulator theorem. So they have this set of possible behaviors, and possible behaviors vary by scale. So when you look at something at the smallest scale, you get different types of behaviors than if you look at it at the intermediate scale and at the large scale, or the sort of the higher order scale. You also have this graph that they give about insufficient systems variety versus sufficient systems variety. And for insufficient, when we have an example of insufficient system variety, that is when we have environmental variety that comes in different shapes over here. And then we have these different interfaces. So that you can think of this as like ligands and receptors in biology, where you have different molecules that have to fit into a receptor. And if it can't fit into the receptor, then it can't signal downstream. But if it can fit into the receptor, then it can signal downstream and you get an effect. In this case, we have environmental variety as a series of shapes, and then they fit into the circle. So you can see that these top three figures, or these top three shapes, fit into their corresponding circle. If they're floating around in a soup and they bind with these circles, I mean, the square won't be able to bind with this blue Pac-Man-like circle, but it can bind with another receptor, and so it tries to just find that receptor and match it. So you have the states, and you have the states in the environment, you have the states at the receptor level. That is where you have a system and you have a regulator, and they can match perfectly. But in this last case, you have a hexagon that's trying to bind into another square, and you can't do that. So this hexagonal ligand or set of ligands have nowhere to map to in terms of the receptors. So this is a lack of variety on the end of these receptors. This is the systems variety that's lacking with respect to the environmental variety. There's a whole class of things that can't be represented. Whereas if we have sufficient systems variety, we have a receptor for every type of environmental variant. And this is actually an interesting question in evolution, because there is a whole literature, or like a little tiny literature maybe, on lock and key systems, which are one example being ligands and receptors. So you have a bunch of ligands that have to have very strict specificity with respect to their receptors. And the idea is, did they co-evolve? How did they co-evolve? And this is a question of variety, because you have this variety of ligands, and then you end up with this variety of receptors, and they kind of have to co-evolve in order to have some informational value. And so how did that happen? That's kind of one of the things that kind of grows out of this experiment, at least as I see it. But this illustrates, I think, very well what happens when you don't have sufficient system variety. And then, the paper goes on and talks about how we can generalize Ashby's law to multiple components. We can actually extend information theory to look at mutual information. We can look at conditional information and things like that. And then this looks at how we have different systems components of various sizes, how we can account for that, and then fit that into that model of requisite variety. So there's a lot of conceptual stuff in this paper, a lot of good mathematics, and just extending this out from this idea, this notion of good regulation to sort of a complex systems view of different states and different scales of analysis. And so this describes coarse graining versus this fine grain description and the differences here. And then finally, we have these different types of partitioning systems or different types of partitioning strategies to sort of map between scales. All right, so that's all of that work. I thought that was a good overview of the law of requisite variety and how it's relevant to different things.
Yeah. I'm in some DMs that Avery needs. We've been talking about this so much, and I wish Avery could have been here directly for that, but we can talk about it next time, perhaps, or it'll be Wednesday. But yes, because they've been bumping up, but okay, how do I take world models into some of what we're doing? How do we deal with all the things you just mentioned? So I'm going to go back and spend a little bit more time on some of those things, because I feel like that sort of I think that's a great positioning, or not quite segue, but on ramp or priming of things that we may talk about in the broader space of Wednesday, with Avery's stuff and my stuff, some of this stuff and your stuff and Amanda's stuff. I think that's a good setup for us. I appreciate you going over that.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting kind of extension of what we're talking about in the paper. We talk about the observer. We don't talk about the part that I was talking about with machine learning models. I mean, we kind of hit on it, but a full demonstration of that, like if you were to actually show a pipeline, a machine learning pipeline, we don't talk about that in the paper, and largely that's because we didn't have enough space. We do some experiments and kind of talk about how you might go about doing this, but it's I'd like to actually build a formal pipeline where we actually take this, the Evergood regulator theorem into account, and then build a training pipeline for models and have multiple models involved, and have that world model sitting on top as being sort of the context or sort of the supervision of the pipeline. So, yeah.
Now, basically, I think, Avery, I hope you're watching this in the future, looking back at this and say, this right here is where we need to come up with a particular set of questions and talk to Bradley about them, because I think the overlap. Oh, I was gonna say to Bradley, is what you're saying related to what's the difference between what you just kind of described and the MetaBrain model project of the past? I don't think it's exactly the same thing. I'm curious if what's the relationship to them?
Well, we know that in a lot of our systems we have different levels of representation. So what that basically means is you have say if you have a symbolic system, you have symbols attached to things. If you have a statistical system, you have a weight matrix attached to things, and they describe different things. But you also have these sort of levels of representation. So sometimes you have a very coarse grained description, which is not it doesn't have a very high detail representation, but it does describe some things about the system. So if I described our system as a set of blocks, which are different, maybe like a heat map, that's a certain level of representation that isn't I mean, it's not necessarily symbolic. It's pretty low level of representation where I can map some of my results to different states, and you can like evaluate that. You can look at differences and things like that. But you can also have much higher level of representational systems where you have multiple symbolic states for a state. So you'd have a heat map that had different contextual cues embedded in it. So you might have like conditional operations where you say a set of blue values mapped to a set of conditions. So if this sort of set of things is true, then this heat map representation is correct. But if this other set of conditional things is true, then this other set of heat map representations is correct. So it's more symbolic information in the model. It's building upon that. And in a metabrain model, you would have like two different layers. You'd have this layer of the conditional operations, you'd have the heat map layer, and then you'd integrate those into a third layer that would have that sort of, that would basically have more state information, a higher number of states. So you'd increase your stateness with your level of representation. If you have a higher degree of representation or a richer representation, then you have more states to work with. If you have a lower level representation, you theoretically have fewer states to work with. But this all assumes that everything is sort of a discrete, it's a discrete set of states. If it's a continuum, or if it's not easy to like sort out those states, then that's a different problem, and you have it's fundamentally different from what Ashby was talking about.
Yeah, I don't think I hoped Avery would get able to come, but they're not really available right now. But I'm like pestering them in chats. So I don't know. Hopefully we can all get on the same page, or I don't know. There's time to talk about things, but ideally I'd like to review this between this and some of the things from earlier today, ahead of Wednesday, because I think to go back to what you're saying about world, what you were saying you wanted to see in terms of the world models and the previous thing you were talking about. Yeah, like I'm very interested in that as well. I think that would the way you described the relationship to some of the top down, the different parts of the unit or model itself, I think is quite relevant to things that Avery's trying to sort out, and also that I'm interested in too, because I feel like that's in the conversation we had last night. I think that touches upon some of the things that we were trying to not mechanistically, but structurally sort out. So to be continued, I guess. That's the conclusion.
Yeah. I did want to talk about one more thing, and that's well, actually, two more things. This is something that's coming up. This was put in the Slack, I think, by Jesse.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, if you're familiar with the Neuromatch Academy, they have summer school classes. This is something that was born out of the pandemic, where all the summer schools closed, and they wanted to have a summer school experience that was virtual for people around the world. They could get their hands dirty with different problems, and you can't necessarily do that with a wet lab, but you can do it with computational methods. And so there was a summer school in 2020 that was on computational neuroscience, and it was basically a 2-week course. It was immersive. It was on Zoom, and people would be able to learn,
it was
a lot of intense lessons.
It was an intensive. Did they break it up to like 3 weeks or?
I think they are 2 or 3 weeks. I can't remember the timeline originally, but
I think they tried to expand it because it was like the first it was like just too concentrated, and they tried it. We were like doing these. We tried to have this like companion slow pod things, right?
Oh yeah.
Wow, I forgot about that until just now. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just said that.
Yeah.
That whole sequence. Like, oof.
So the point is that it's an immersive course that has a lot of information, but it's also virtual, and it was recorded. so you could go back and revisit it and do it at your own speed. And so then they had expanded that in a couple of years after 2020 to deep learning. So there's a deep learning course that they have, which is the same. And that's something that we've also been involved with. And then they, of course, had a climate change course, which was Climate Match, I think. And that's another course that they've had, which is the same model. And now they have a fourth course. And this course is on computational behavior. So this is a partnership between NeuroMatch Academy, which is now a like an open source foundation, open education foundation, and Connected Minds, which I'm not familiar with. But they're partnering together to host this course on computational behavior, analytics, and models of individual and interacting agents. So this is going to be very interesting. This course will teach the computational foundations of collective behavior, from processing raw behavioral recordings to modeling how agents perceive, communicate, coordinate, and form collectives. So this is a lot of the stuff that we're doing in the representational brains and phenotypes. They're using, they have data sets that they make available to the students. The students learn how to process the data sets and build models from that, and then they answer questions. So this is very much in the same vein as all the other courses. And you do that over the course of the intensive. So you're getting all this exposure to different areas. It's like a fire hose, or drinking from a fire hose. And then you're also doing this project where you're applying to your learning. It's very intense, but a lot of times, a lot of good projects come out of this.
Gunnar.
So Gunnar Blom, who is involved in NeuroMatch, he's the course director. I guess that's going to happen sometime this summer. So,
well, right, what they're doing right now, I just saw, and that's what I thought, or like I heard things, and then I saw in the thing you had, the full course will launch next year.
okay.
But right now they're looking for beta testers, curriculum developers, and volunteers to help out with this development. Like I think it just got what's it called? Like accepted, like, okay, they committed, okay, we're doing this and now we want help to build it out. And I think the first real, if you want to be a student of it, it'd be next year. But if you want to help build it now, I think there's a number of there's gonna be different rounds of call for volunteering, basically call for curriculum development. If you're more experienced and can develop curriculum, there's also gonna be coursework beta testers ahead. But definitely, I think it's kind of obvious here, but we've done things with NeuroMatch in the past. There's been a mentor, I've been a professional development mentor, so we're kind of not exactly in-house, but we're longtime friends and supporters. So I really like what they're doing. I like that they're basically, my favorite thing about NeuroMatch is they're trying to take, I think, a somewhat heroic stance of we're going to do education better and differently and more accessibly. And they've taken on a lot of challenges in doing that over the years, and they're limited in their scope. Not everybody wants to do computational neuroscience type things, but it's great. I support them very much. So as much as we can, help them, I try to mention them and so on. And,
Yeah.
so good things there, and I'm glad that Bradley mentioned it today too.
Yeah. So that's something to keep an eye out for. The other thing is this paper, and I'll get back to it next week, but I wanted to just point it out. This is a paper from Nature Machine Intelligence. I found it very interesting because it applies this developmental concept and applies it to sort of a very practical vision or computer vision problem. So this is adopting a human developmental visual diet, which yields a robust and shape-based AI vision. So this is about I guess a neural network that's doing image processing, and they're using sort of the principles of human visual system development, this idea of a visual diet, which is basically where you're pruning the network and you're doing things that a developmental system would do to refine visual acuity and things like that. So this is talking about what they're doing here. Despite years of research and the dramatic scaling of artificial intelligence systems, a striking misalignment between artificial and human vision persists. Contrary to humans, AI relies heavily on texture features rather than shape information. So this is some difference between humans and AI. Lacks robustness to image distortions, remains highly vulnerable to adversarial attacks, and struggles to recognize simple abstract shapes with complex backgrounds. So to close this gap, we take inspiration from how human vision develops from early infancy into adulthood. We quantified visual maturation by synthesizing decades of research into a novel developmental visual diet for AI vision. Guiding AI systems through this human-inspired curriculum, so it's curriculum learning, which considers the development of visual acuity, contrast sensitivity, and color, produces models that better align with human behavior, on every hallmark of robust vision tested, yielding strong reliance on shape information, abstract shape recognition beyond the state of the art, and higher resilience to image corruptions and adversarial attacks. Our results thus demonstrate that robust AI vision can be achieved by guiding how a model learns, not merely how much it learns. So instead of just dumping training data on the model and expecting it to learn just everything, throwing the kitchen sink at the model and expecting it to learn everything, you have to guide the model how it learns and maybe what it doesn't learn. And then that's the key to this sort of thing. So there's pruning of the network, but it's also about curriculum learning. What is the curriculum? So there's this whole field of autocurricular learning where it's or curriculum learning, where you're trying to figure out how to teach, the best way to teach. It's like you're teaching humans. What's the best way to teach people? What's the best way to teach an algorithm? That's sort of the idea. And then, of course, there's the stuff that happens as you pick the right training regimen that help guide learning. And so that's what we're doing here. So the paper is really, we can get into it next week, but it's really dense. But hopefully it's a good method. I've not seen any of the code, so I don't know, but yeah, looks promising. Jesse, you're muted.
I wrote a hashtag developmental AI in the chat. So,
Okay.
Looking forward to that next week. A lot of good stuff this week.
All right. Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.